The Montreal Protocol healed the ozone layer with refrigerants that proved hundreds of times more potent at trapping heat than carbon dioxide. This is Unintended Consequences, Episode 87. In September 1987, diplomats and chemists gathered in Montreal to sign a treaty that would phase out chlorofluorocarbons. These were the chemicals that had carved a hole in the protective ozone layer over Antarctica. They chose hydrofluorocarbons as the practical substitute because these compounds contained no chlorine and would not damage the stratosphere. Within 20 years, the same molecules, now installed in millions of air conditioners and refrigerators worldwide, were releasing greenhouse gases whose cumulative warming effect rivaled that of several major industrial sectors. The decision grew directly from the 1974 work of chemists Mario Molina and F. Sherwood Rowland. They showed that chlorine atoms from CFCs could catalytically destroy ozone. By the mid-1980s, the British Antarctic Survey had confirmed a seasonal ozone hole. Governments faced pressure to act before ultraviolet radiation increased skin cancers and crop damage. Industry chemists at companies such as DuPont and ICI searched for drop-in replacements that could use existing compressors and cooling systems without requiring entirely new infrastructure. Hydrofluorocarbons appeared ideal because they carried no ozone-depleting chlorine. They performed well as refrigerants and were non-flammable under normal conditions. At the time, atmospheric models treated most HFCs as short-lived compared with carbon dioxide. Their infrared-absorbing properties therefore received little regulatory attention. The urgency centered on restoring the ozone column quickly enough to limit measurable increases in surface UV. The Montreal Protocol entered into force in 1989 and required developed countries to eliminate CFC production by 1996. HFC 134A entered commercial production in 1990 and quickly replaced CFC 12 in automotive air conditioning and domestic refrigerators. By 2000, global HFC consumption had risen from near zero to roughly 300,000 metric tons per year. The treaty's technical committees and the UN Environment Program praised the transition as a model of rapid technological substitution. Early measurements from the Advanced Global Atmospheric Gases Experiment Network showed rising atmospheric concentrations of HFC 134A and HFC 143A. These increases were still viewed primarily as a monitoring success rather than an emerging climate concern. Because the new molecules slotted into the same compressors, expansion valves, and service procedures already in use, adoption accelerated without the capital cost of redesigning entire fleets of equipment or factory lines. HFCs absorb infrared radiation far more efficiently than carbon dioxide because their molecular bonds vibrate at wavelengths that overlap with Earth's outgoing heat. Laboratory measurements placed the 100-year global warming potential of HFC 134A at approximately 1,430 times that of CO2, and HFC 23 at more than 14,000 times. As incomes rose in China, India, and Southeast Asia after 2000, sales of room air conditioners grew from roughly 30 million units annually to over 100 million by 2015. Each unit was typically charged with 1 to 2 kilograms of HFC refrigerant. Leaks during manufacture, servicing, and end-of-life disposal released the gases directly into the atmosphere. Because HFCs also served as feedstocks for fluoropolymers and as propellants, their emissions climbed even in regions that had already phased out CFCs. Second-order effects appeared in energy demand. The very efficiency of HFC-based cooling encouraged larger and more numerous installations. This increased electricity consumption and associated carbon emissions from power plants. By the early 2010s, estimates from the World Meteorological Organization suggested that unchecked HFC growth could add between 0.3 and 0.5 degrees Celsius to global temperatures by 2100. That offset a substantial fraction of the climate gains expected from other mitigation efforts. The arithmetic compounds quickly once one multiplies the per kilogram potency by the annual leak rate across hundreds of millions of units. Even a 5% annual loss rate on a growing installed base produces emissions whose integrated forcing rivals entire national CO2 inventories within a decade or two. Scientific papers published in 2009 and 2010 drew explicit attention to the climate impact. They prompted the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the European Commission to begin restricting high GWP HFCs in new equipment. In October 2016, parties to the Montreal Protocol adopted the Kigali Amendment. It schedules a gradual phase-down of HFC production and consumption, aiming for an 80 to 85% reduction by 2047 in developed countries. Manufacturers responded by commercializing hydrofluoroolefins and natural refrigerants such as propane and carbon dioxide. These substitutes introduced new trade-offs in flammability, operating pressures, and cost. The amendment itself created a modest new administrative layer inside an already complex treaty. Yet it preserved the same institutional machinery that had managed the original CFC phase-out. Current atmospheric measurements show HFC concentrations still rising, but the rate of increase has begun to slow in regions that adopted early controls. The shift also required retraining technicians to handle mildly flammable HFO blends and to manage higher pressure CO2 systems. This illustrated how one atmospheric correction propagates into supply chain and safety protocol adjustments. When a single environmental metric drives substitution, molecules that score well on that metric can still impose large costs on other systems such as climate stability. Decision makers therefore benefit from requiring explicit multi-impact assessments before large-scale adoption, even when the primary crisis appears urgent. The same logic applies today to choices among battery chemistries, carbon capture solvents, or alternative proteins. Each fix carries its own downstream atmospheric or resource signature that may not become visible for a decade or more. In practice, this means testing not only the immediate performance gain, but also the cumulative forcing that results when the substitute scales to billions of devices operating across decades of imperfect containment. How would you weigh the immediate performance of a new battery chemistry against the long-term resource demands it creates once it reaches billions of devices? We'll leave it there for today. Thanks for thinking through this one with me. If you know someone who loves a good cautionary tale, send it their way, and I'll see you tomorrow with another. And if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at NARA Network, links in the show notes. And before you go, this show is part of the NARA Network, a family of daily podcasts on tech, science, and markets, each one a short, sharp briefing you can finish on the commute. If today earned its place in your feed, here's your next listen. Tesla Shorts Time, your daily deep dive into everything Tesla. Find every show free at naranetwork.com. Following the long arcs, story trackers on naranetwork.com follow major programs across episodes: Tesla, SpaceX, AI, space science, and more. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.